Well, here we are at St Paul's Centre, and we're going to have a talk today as Disability Discrimination to celebrate the coming to force of the new legislation. 12 months' time, we shall have a follow-up, no doubt, for this and tell us what wonderful things have been achieved. But that's it today, so we can record it and see what happens.
It's about. Some of these terms you're going to see are really outdated and some people might find slightly offensive. To be fair, they were in common usage even probably 10 years ago. But if we talk through them, then you'll see what I mean. So, when people talk about the disabled, it's far better to use people with disabilities. It's more inclusive language and it's not labelling people. Wheelchair bound, you will hear someone saying there's someone in reception who's wheelchair bound. Lots of wheelchair users use a wheelchair for certain times of the day, certain times of their life, when they've got a long journey to do. Just because someone is a wheelchair user certainly does not mean that they are wheelchair bound. And even someone who needs a wheelchair to get around for any mobility purposes, I don't think that's particularly a good term to use. Morning. Morning. Come in.
Hello.
Okay.
Yeah,
take a seat there.
Right there, look.
Yeah.
Can you see okay there?
You right there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And some of those other terms are what people would have used in the not too distant past, unfortunately. People with handicaps. It's actually, a person with a disability, a person with an impairment is far more inclusive language to use. So again, a term that perhaps used to be used, person with a mental handicap, we talk about an intellectual disability now. That's far more descriptive and far more friendly a term to use. Someone with learning difficulties is better described as someone with learning differences. Anyone who's got a different way of learning should not be excluded from the education system. And the education system is coming round to that way of thinking now. We can't cubbyhole people just because they don't happen to fit into what's deemed to be an accepted way of teaching. There are lots of other buttons that people with all sorts of intellectual disabilities will respond to in a much more positive way. And use of the word normal, rather than just someone who isn't disabled is far more inclusive. And some of those other words, you will possibly hear people on the street using. We far prefer to use, someone with a mental health disability. And even someone who suffers from a particular condition. Again, they may or may not suffer from a condition. Just because someone has a condition, it's far more important to say if that is going to restrict them, then it's something that they have rather than strictly something that they suffer from. Okay, so the evolution of the disability side of the discrimination law. A consultation paper went out on the 4th of September 2017, and we were very much part of that consultation right from the beginning. It's fair to say that the evolution of our discrimination law is closely akin to the UK Equality Act. There are some quite big differences in our disability regulations compared to the UK, but the suite of legislation that we have broadly mirrors what's in the UK Equality Act. I think the one final piece of the jigsaw which is still missing, even after yesterday, is religion and belief, and I'm sure that in future years there will be campaigns to get that included as part of our discrimination law, because it very much stacks up with all the other protected characteristics. So the actual law came into force, as I've said, on the 1st of September 2018, and it protects against direct discrimination and indirect discrimination, but it also permits more favourable treatment of those with a disability. So what we call the concept of positive actions. So it allows people perhaps to apply more favourable treatment when everything else is equal in a given situation. So, disability itself is a protected characteristic, and as I've mentioned, the UK legislation is different to ours. Ours is what's called a social model, whereas the UK law is a medical model. So ours is far more inclusive. Most or lots of tribunals in the UK spend the first 2 days arguing about whether or not a particular claim is within or not within scope. And it's because their system of deciding whether someone has a protected characteristic of disability is a medical model and is far more open to interpretation and argument, whereas ours is far more inclusive. And that's some of this is obviously straight out of the legislation, but that is the strict definition of someone who has a protected characteristic of disability. So there are inclusions and exclusions, like any legislation. So severe disfigurement is an inclusion, but other than tattooing or piercing or body decorative or anything for non-medical purposes. There are, again, specific exclusions, so the tendency to set fires, steal, or physically or sexually abuse another person. And of course, there's lots that kind of sits in the middle. I think because ours is a social model, it is far more inclusive, but then there's lots of things that might sit around the edges that people might not immediately consider to be something which is covered by the legislation. And obviously smoking and alcohol addiction were, two of the things that came up because I guess they are some of the most prevalent parts or problems within our society. But when you look at something like addiction, for me, addiction is addiction. And if someone has got a long-term problem as a result of their addiction, it very often does lead on to all sorts of other complications. So, like any of this legislation, if you're an employer, it's far better to work with your employee rather than against them and see what provisions can be made. And I'll come on to what those look like further on in the presentation. And of course, like any legislation, there are defences. There are justifiable defences. I think the important thing to remember about adjustments is the term reasonable adjustments. And of course, what does reasonable mean? Ultimately, of course, it could be for the tribunal to decide what reasonable actually means. But, they do take into account things like the nature of the business, the income of the business, compared to what the cost might be to make those reasonable adjustments. But the important thing to remember is so many of these things can be done really cheaply. So many of these things can be done with only a little bit of thought. And so many of the problems that arise from claims are actually bad customer service rather than breaching the legislation. So bad customer service can lead on to someone making a claim. And very often this could have been nipped in the bud so much earlier if people had just trained their staff or taken a little bit of thought. But these are fairly much standard exemptions within the legislation, and that they would be defences that people might bring to a tribunal. Some of them are more black and white than others. Some of them might be argued. But, before anyone went down that road, they would probably need to make sure that their defence is as tight as it can be. Let me give you some examples now of direct and indirect discrimination. I'll just read this verbatim if I may. All of these examples are extracted from that leaflet that you've got, and it does make for quite good reading. Again, some of these really simple. So St Jude's is a nightclub that prides itself on its fashionable clientele. George, the door supervisor, refuses to let Matt into the club. Matt has Down syndrome and George does not think he suits the image of the club. Very straightforward, this would be direct discrimination. George is refusing to admit Matt because of his disability. That would be unlawful. Another example, Michael's Bistro is an intimate restaurant with low lighting and a menu written in small grey font on large white card. This could be indirect discrimination because of the practice of printing the menu in a way that places people with a visual impairment to a particular disadvantage. This issue will be whether the bistro can show the design of the menu is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. I think they would probably be on pretty dodgy ground doing that, but again, that might be their defence if it did need to go to a tribunal. An answer would be have two menus if you really wanted to print your menu in that soft grey font. But the reality is, what is good customer service? Good customer service is that all of your clients can see your menu and see what's on offer. You know, that's far more important than creating an ambience. So, the duty to make reasonable adjustments to premises requirement came in on the 1st of September, but of course businesses have had 2 years to get ready for this, 2 years to consider what they need to do. Like anything, our older buildings might not be so easy to adjust, and building bylaws perhaps might play a part in whether or not stairs can be removed and a ramp installed. But again, it's 9 times out of 10 there are some really simple options that you can use, such as a transportable ramp, something that can be put in place. But again, there has to be that balance between causing someone embarrassment or, you know, drawing attention to someone where it's a big sort of kerfuffle to get a ramp out and everyone can see them going up the ramp. Far more better if you've got the ability to have a ramp alongside steps or remove the steps altogether. But we always got to bear in mind that those bylaws might take precedence. The good news is current building regulations, so anything going forwards, will be built with this legislation in mind. So we will slowly design any problems out going forwards. So we'll look at some examples of reasonable adjustments to premises, and this just goes to show how simple some of these adjustments can be. So Sam has a social anxiety disorder and can struggle to cope with open plan and shared office spaces. His employer operates a hot desking policy. To help him work effectively, Sam is allowed to work from home for 2 days a week, and for the other 3 working days he is given his own desk in the corner of the office with a partition screen to give him more privacy. You know, this was written before working from home was prevalent as it is now, and lots of employers have had to make those adjustments just to survive in business. Lots of employees might want to continue working from home because actually they find they're more productive, they find it suits their lifestyle, they find ultimately it's better for the environment, and of course there's that balance about the economy and the environment. But I think lots of employers are now seeing the benefits of people working from home and just how effective they can be when they've got the kit and they still being able to stay in contact with a team. I think that's the important thing when you're working from home. And you know, now that we've got platforms like Teams and Zoom and all the others, you know, we've all demonstrated that we can be very much part of a team and still sit at home. Another example here, Philippa is autistic and finds watching films in the cinema challenging. CI Cinema has introduced relaxed screenings of new releases on one Sunday each month with subtle changes to the environment, including lower sound levels, the lights kept on low level and no trailers or adverts. The experience is more positive for people who are autistic as well as people who have sensory impairments. You've already seen lots of supermarkets are offering a day or an afternoon where they soften the lighting, where they soften the music and make the whole experience far better for people who have got sensory impairments. Really positive move there by lots of the supermarkets. They were doing this again long before yesterday, which is great. So, liability, and again we're not lawyers, I'm just pointing out parts of the legislation. So, an employer is vicariously liable for acts of discrimination by its employees during the course of their employment. This is why it is so important to ensure that anyone who employs staff are trained, understand the issues, understand how to deal with all clients, but in particular clients with disabilities, and be as inclusive as possible. So it applies regardless of whether the act was done with the employer's knowledge or approval. And ultimately, of course, you know, the cost of getting this wrong is twofold. Firstly, the reputational loss could be huge, and I've got some examples that I'll show you that have already happened in the UK. And secondly, cost is really prohibitive. You know, it could cost a business up to £10,000, £5,000 for hurt and distress. So yeah, it's something to be avoided, and you know, nine times out of 10, very simply avoided. The horror of tribunals is perhaps quite a strong term, but anyone who's been through the tribunal process on the wrong end of it will tell you that it is not a pleasant process. It's time consuming. If you're a business, it takes you away from what you should be doing, which is trying to run your business. And the good news is there is other options in place, particularly for discrimination law. So when a complaint is made to the Jersey Employment and Discrimination Tribunal, they now automatically pass it to citizens' advice. And what we will do is we will endeavour to get both parties together so that community mediation can be implemented. And if both parties agree, and that's the important thing, both parties have to agree to this course of action, we will get those parties together with a trained mediator who will listen to both sides of the argument and try to get the parties to come to an agreement outside of the tribunal. I think the important thing is there was no pressure on anyone to make a decision on the day. There was no pressure on either party to accept any ultimate agreement which is put in place, and any agreement which is signed and sealed on the day or subsequently is without prejudice to any further action. So if an agreement is put in place and one of the parties reneges on that agreement, that does not stop further action being taken. But what it provides is less formal, perhaps friendlier way of resolving those differences. And from our experience of other discrimination cases that we've helped to mediate on, most people actually just want an apology. You know, if there is money in it, it's actually normally a secondary consideration. Most people just want to sit there with the person, get a genuine apology, and also prove that this won't happen to another person. That is the overriding principle. So some people actually get an award from the tribunal and they give it away to a charity. It means so little to them. But of course, those financial penalties have to be in place to give the law some teeth. So there are some companies that offer audits where they'll go around premises and check that everything is in place. And it's a good thing to do, because what it offers you is an objective view on what your premises is like and what it offers and what could be changed. And again, most of these companies who will go around and offer those audits, 9 times out of 10, they're giving you some really simple things to do. And some of it can be, you know, have opaque pieces on windows where you've got a clear screen so that it's really obvious that it's a window and it's not a walk-through. Consider your heights on your tables. Try avoid putting changing facilities in accessible toilets. You know, it's not always possible, but if you can split those two things up, always going to be better. Always consider people with hidden disabilities. I think people consider so many disabilities as a visual thing that you're automatically going to be aware of. Lots of disabilities are completely hidden, and again, I've got some really good examples of hidden disabilities for you. Entrances, fees for people with carers. You know, is it right that someone with a carer has to pay for that person and the carer to go into whatever it is? Far better to look at a policy on that and reconsider whether that's the best course of action. You know, when you're talking to someone, talking to an individual, don't talk to the person who's with them, the person who's caring for them. Try and talk to the individual themselves, because that's how anyone would like to be spoken to, rather than through a third party. Basically, remember that discrimination, by and large, is not difficult. It needs some thought, it needs some consideration, sometimes it needs some extra advice because people just don't know what they should be looking out for. That leaflet actually will give you some really good basics on what you should and shouldn't be doing, and be able to offer you some good insights. What I've got here is there's a couple of things. I've got some stories that have come out